welcome you to this series of talks, Parallel Voices, which is now in its second year. And this year's series of talks focuses on performance, visual arts, and moving image. And it's been created by myself in conjunction with the kind, patient support of Siobhan Davies' studio, which of course includes Sue, who has generously invited me to create this series in her wonderful space, and who worked side by side with me devising this series. I'm also indebted to the kindness and support of Alison Proctor, who has put up with all my insistent demands, which I hope she can forgive me for, and Nina Baker, who has worked on publishing the series. This series is entitled Expanding Choreographic Imaginations, and you might be asking yourselves what the hell. It is my hope to discuss the relationship between visual arts, performance, and their creative evolution and their present manifestations. My approach to making images parallels that of choreography. For example, the use of camera work, sound, creating mise-en-scène in multi-screen works. For me, expanding the choreographic imagination is about the interrelated conversations and practices that develop where different artistic disciplines intersect and contaminate one another. Today, we can see it across a wide variety of artistic visual art practices in the cinema, video art, dance, theatre, performance, architecture, which is very exciting and indicates to me an epistemological break with certain market demands. I want to argue that these questions of the choreographic imagination need to be relocated in the archive of moving image practices, where the history of different artistic practices and disciplines resonate. We need to trace those trajectories to make sense of the present. Anyone who saw the exhibition of Bruce Nauman, Brutal Beauty, at the Sometime Gallery earlier this year, recognized my obsession with what Derrida has termed archive fever, which is why Bruce Nauman begins this series and we end with Yvonne Rainer. And of course, Pablo Bronstein from a younger generation who also explores these ideas. So when I was first approached by Sue to create a series of talks and discussions between performance, moving image, and dance, I jumped at the chance because it seemed to me that we had both noticed that something significant had been developing in the arts amongst artists across disciplines which converge around the axis of what I detect as a new strain of performance in the arts. This has been significant, for example, in Rosalie Goldberg's Performer Biennales of 2005 and 2007, and in Tate Modern's program of live art events created by Catherine Wood, who will be joining us in conversation. And finally, Joan Bell's recent performance at Sadler's Wells, as well as my own collaboration with Russell Malafant, Cast No Shadow, all of which have enjoyed significant audiences. The rise of performance art in the moving image and dance world signals, perhaps for me, a reaction to the overwhelming presence of the object which is prized by the art market, but also at the same time, ideas in visual arts and dance have been supplanted by other drives and interests which are about fulfilling the demands, I would say, of a petty bourgeois audience and the normalizing of expectations. Today, artists and creators alike are expected to play number games of audience counting, the ticking of boxes, creating balance sheets that meet governmental criteria as the spaces for experimentation becomes less. We seldom debate art's effects, especially on artists, critics, and curators. These days, the interest in the arts are about Christie's auctions and celebrity train spotting. So Parallel Voices is timely, I think, because it revives the art of conversation to discuss experimentation across different artistic disciplines which may share history beyond the current market expediencies. An archive rooted in ideas which cross artistic boundaries. One of my long-term objectives is to make work which breaks down the barriers which exist between different artistic disciplines, a self-reflexive practice which draws from and comments on film, dance, photography, music, painting, sculpture, which aims to both unite and deconstruct these themes, which sometimes feel like hegemonies. It seems to me that currently it has been performance that holds a key and a promise for breaking down at these barriers, producing a radicality that has been lost to the market. Perhaps it may be useful for me to provide with you, or to provide for you, a working definition of what is meant by performance. We have been told that the definition of performance is a situation that involves four basic elements: time, space, the performer's body, and a relationship between the performer and the audience, in which the actions of an individual in a particular place at a particular time constitutes the work. But perhaps the more current definition is provided by Rosalie Goldberg, the director of Performer BNR, when she states in her book, Performance Arts from Futurism to the Present, quote, "Performance has been a way of appealing directly to a large public as well as looking and shocking audiences to reassess their own notions of art and its relation to culture. Conversely, public interest in the medium, particularly in the 1980s, and dare I say currently, stems from an apparent desire of that public to gain access to the art world, to be a spectator of its rituals, its distinctive community, and to be surprised by the unexpected, always unorthodox presentations that the artist devise," end of quote. The artist and critic Michael Corris also provides an interesting insight in his book on conceptual art when he discusses the art collective Art and Language. He suggests that perhaps the development of conceptual art occurs between learning and conversation, which historically has developed around a perceived crisis and loss of critical reflection in each discipline. Sometimes I wonder if this could be occurring again, and hence my interest in Bruce Nauman. This interest stems from the premise of his astute interdisciplinarity, which for me and Sue, I think, provides a perfect springboard and model for our discussions. Bruce Nauman has long been recognized as one of the most innovative and provocative contemporary artists. He had the simple but profound realization, quote, that if I was an artist, that I was in the studio, then whatever I was doing in the studio must be art. At this point, art became more of an activity and less of a product, end of quote. And this is what I find interesting about his work. As Christine will discuss further, by working in diverse media of sculpture, video, film, printmaking, performance, and installation, Nauman concentrates less on the development of a characteristic style and more on the way in which a process or an activity can transform or become a work of art. So please can I introduce Christine Nash, here on my left, who, as well as a very dear friend, is the chief curator at the Pompidou Centre, Paris, where she has developed and heads the largest international collection of new media art in the world. She has created major international shows by acclaimed artists and also written extensively about video and the new media art, including a show at the Whitney Museum and a book on Bruce Nauman. In fact, I first saw Christine's extraordinary Bruce Nauman show at the Hayward Gallery in 1988, and since then I have had the honor and privilege to work with her at the Pompidou on my show Phantom Creole in 2005. Since then, she has created many groundbreaking exhibitions, including Video Art, 1965 to 2005, an exhibition tracing 4 decades of video art from the collection of Centre Pompidou in Paris, from the media art's inception to the 60s to the present day. Christine Nash not only presents an evolution of the video image in contemporary art, but also explores the impact of video art on our culture. For example, critiques of social issues, gender politics, surveillance, and the power of mass media and popular culture through works by artists who have greatly influenced the development of the new media: Nam June Paik, Bruce Nauman, Valerie Export, Dara Bimvam, and contemporary media art, Chris Marker, David Claerbout, Pierre Huyghe. Also, who will be joining us for a conversation at the end of Christine's presentation is Mark Nash, who is head of the Creating Contemporary Art at the Royal College of Art. A filmmaker and a creator, Mark Nash is also a film theorist. He has recently published a collection of essays on the moving image in film and art for Palgrave Macmillan. He works as an independent creator, having co-created Documentary 11, the third Berlin Biennale in the film section, an exhibition of moving image artists' works titled Experiments with Truth, amongst others. His work also includes editing Screen and co-writing the script with me in 1996 for the acclaimed film Frantz Fanon, Black Skins, White Masks, which Mark also produced. He recently created a retrospective of Catalan filmmaker Portabella at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2007, and is currently developing a research curatorial project on the legacy of the Cold War in cinema, art, and architecture. There will be a discussion between Mark and Christine after Christine's presentation on Bruce Nauman, after which there will be an opportunity to ask questions. May I take my hand in introducing Christine Van Assche.
I think the main purpose of this evening is to discuss. So I'm going to be very quick, but present quickly the work of Bruce Nauman, for those who don't know. You see some of the performance tapes on the screens here, and also you have a film downstairs. But Bruce Nauman is not only a video artist or performance artist, he has also a multidisciplinary work. So I'm going to go very quick on this. So as you can see, he's using every disciplinary possible: performance, film, video, soundtrack, objects, installation, drawings, sculpture. His method is quite simple, but he has been working on it more than 20 years. He has drawn an inventory of materials: light, sound, words, audiovisual effect, neon lighting, wax, hologram, and movement is one of it. He is isolating one parameter and then giving it a different interpretation. He is deconstructing since the 60s. He is manipulating, reversing, slowing down. You can see this in the videotapes. His method in this film and videos, he works in his studio, interpreting all the possibilities of a simple corporal vocabulary, experimenting with elementary phenomena that are isolated, taken out of their context, and deconstructed according to their simple expression. Quoting Bruce Nauman from an interview done and published in Parquet magazine in '86, "When I started doing performance, I drew up a list of possibilities for executing certain type of movement: standing up, leaning, sitting, lying down. I established a list of what seemed to be discrete movement. When carrying out performance, I noticed that certain positions seemed to incorporate powerful emotional ties, while others were mere modification of postures that had no significance. This physical exercise develops certain complex aspects of the human body. They are not just physical, because they led to symbolic evocation. Nauman used the body to transform intimate subjectivity into an objective demonstration. Man is both the one who perceived and is perceived. is working in a simple manner. There's a camera which films his movement during 60 minutes in his studio while he's evolving alone with nobody around. And then he used special effects, like very simple special effects from the 60s, slow motion, image inversion. There are some sound also in those tapes. There's the tension is created by the contrast between real time and the time of the film or the video. The titles are also very evocative. Playing a note on the violin while I walk around the studio, walking in an exaggerated manner, revolving upside down, slow angle walk, stamping in the studio, walk with contrappesto, violin turned dead. He didn't, I look at all his interviews and to find a quotation about dance, but he didn't talk much about it. He just told in an interview published in '71 in Avalanche magazine in New York, I don't know much about dancing because I live on the West Coast where distances are great, but I knew Merce Cunningham and the work of John Cage, who lived in New York, some of whose pieces I had heard. What caught my attention was the attitude implied by the transformation of a normal activity into a formal representation. That is what Merce used to do in dance and John Cage in music. A little later, in the 80s, it's interesting to see how the work of Bruce Nauman evolved from performance to installation, from subjective work to more objective work. So after producing about 15 film and video alone in his studio, he handed the task over the spectator by inventing arrangement, installation, to place the spectator in a certain condition. He creates specific spaces, areas, corridors, cubes, conditioning the movement of the spectator in these spaces. These installations are frequently accompanied by surveillance camera that add supplementary element to his vocabulary. The spectator is confronted by a distorted image that is out of sync with himself. He sees himself from a distance. He is inverted in another space-time. Our experience with image is usually a frontal one, but in this case, it is neither frontal nor temporal. The spectator experiments with the space not only physiologically, but also emotionally and intellectually. So here you have a drawing of one of his space installations with 4 video cameras. And here you have the installation, the cube with the 4 monitors and the cameras. And here you have myself experimenting the installation. So the spectator sees his image always one corner later. I don't know if you have experimented this in real time once, but it's a very efficient installation. And this is from the 70s. Thus, he says, if I have the opportunity to create a situation in which another person does what I would do, it is sufficient. Most of this work set up very rigorous situation or environment. In consequence, even if the person doesn't know anything about me or what the work brings into play, he will always be capable of producing something very similar to what I would have done myself. And here you can read yourself. Bruce Nauman was very influenced by the phenomenological philosophy. which was around at that time, and the main thinker is Merleau-Ponty. He read probably the book called La structure du comportement, la phénoménologie de la perception, Structure of Comportment, Phenomenology of Perception. That's it. I hope it was understandable. You can ask a question, or I can repeat if necessary.
That was a quick survey of Bruce's work, and although I had a few notes written myself, I think it would be good to unpack some of the things you were saying and connect them to the theme of performance and dance today. But first I thought maybe just so that people who don't know this work or they're seeing it for the first time, maybe you could just say a little bit more about the conditions of production. I mean, I'll start off and then you can interrupt me when I get it wrong, but I think one of the interesting things about this work is that it's made with one of the first video cameras that was available in America for recording. Well, in the art world, I think Leo Castelli had given a camera to Bruce Nauman, and so Bruce Nauman was one of the first few artists to be able to work with video. I think Nam June Paik was the first, and one or two others also began to work in the late 60s with video. And of course, the 60-minute tapes that Christine's talking about were 60-minute because the very early videos were 60-minute reels and they couldn't be cut. So actually video was this ideal medium for exploring the issue of duration. So it's a bit like, the video was also a bit like a performance space. You switched the camera on and then you had to keep it going for the whole time. And I was wondering whether you've thought at all, Christine, about how that apparatus affects his work. I mean, is it, at what point does he stop using the reel-to-reels which force you to use these 1-hour segments and begin to use editing?
The question is about editing or about video in general?
Well, it's more about at what point the sort of video apparatus changes the way or the way he works with the video.
I think before all these tapes, he was doing simple object and some early film that we saw where he was filming outdoor. And it's through this closed circuit, because it's a closed circuit system, that he started working on himself. In fact, and it was at the same time as other artists like Vito Acconci, Dan Graham. There was a kind of interest in the mirror effect of the video closed circuit.
Yeah.
And we know all the famous texts by Rosalind Krauss on this mirror effect that artists use. And of course, video was perfect because it was a mirror at the time. You know, they switch on the camera, they switch on the TV set, and they were looking at themselves. And at the same time, they were thinking, why not tape us? Because we are just using a camera and a monitor. Let's tape us. And then they were taping it. There was no editing system at that time. It was not possible to cut, make it shorter. So they were using the tape in real time, and usually the length of the tape, which was 60 minutes.
You know, I just thought that would be interesting for people to understand that it's a very different audiovisual system to the present day when there are so many other possibilities. But at that moment, the performance and video, as it were, come together because the apparatus insists that you do something for an hour, and as you say, the other thing that's happening is that it's not only is it a closed circuit, but it's a totally private situation. Certainly Bruce Nauman, these are all filmed with the studio just by himself. He switches them on and then leaves it, so there's no other person observing.
But Nauman used again that system in the recent installation that you may have seen at the Tate Modern, called Mapping the Studio, a big installation with five projection, in which he switched the camera. He switched 5 cameras during the night, every night during 1 month. And the result are those also very long tapes, but he is not in anymore. He's out. And this was done in the year 2001. And that's the big difference between 75 and 2001.
But it's still part of that same concept that anything that I do in the studio is art, and even if what I do is set up the cameras and then leave and it records in real time. I also wanted to ask a little bit about his interest in Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology, because I seem to remember from reading of artists at the time and from an interview that he did with Peter Schedal when we were in the States, that he and other people are also very interested in behavioral psychology as well, and the psychology of perception, that there was quite a sort of anti-psychoanalytic movement, so they weren't interested in emotion and character and action in a more conventional way. And that, I think, was one of the kind of quite radical things that he was doing, but also makes the break with conventional theatre and cinema, because you can't talk about emotions that you have when watching or experiencing Nauman pieces, except in a very general way, like anger or claustrophobia or something.
But also in the early 70s, it is interesting to underline that anti-psychiatry was using video camera with these patients, their patients, and artists like Dan Graham discover video through his doctor.
Well, that's interesting, yes, because there was just some article in the paper the other day about R.D. Laing, in fact, one of the fathers of psych. But I mean, what I was thinking when we were talking earlier, because I work, as Isaac said, in the Royal College of Art, and I run a curating program there, and one of the focuses of our course it's called Curating Contemporary Art, and people say, well, what is contemporary? And we say it's after 1960, roughly speaking, because in 1960 there was this big change in the way contemporary art functioned. The whole economy of contemporary art changed towards much more conceptual, process-based works. It wasn't so object-focused. And you can't say that about every generation. You can't say contemporary is the last 50 years. And there hasn't really been an equivalent kind of shift later on. At least I think so, although I may be just showing my age, because the 60s was also the time when I was getting involved in contemporary art. But I was wondering whether you could say a little bit about this, what Isaac talked about, this rediscovery, if you like, of the 60s and conceptualism and work like this, and whether there are artists that you know who are exploring these things today in a similar kind of way.
Yes, in general, there is, of course, a big interest from the artists, from the visual artists, but also the performing artists, the dance artists, into the 60s and the 70s. And to talk about the French scene, a lot of performing, dancing artists came to the Pompidou Center, where they could look at all those tapes And I know that they are watching. All the performance from those artists from the 60s, and I can see through their work later that they were really influenced by this 60s, 70s scene, and they reenact the attitude of the 60s, 70s in their own work. And I think here you had Jérôme Bell, who came here, and Jérôme Bell is one of the artists who I think saw a lot of the tapes from the collection, but also Xavier Leroy or Alain Buffard. They all went through those tapes, and they spent hours and hours watching all this attitude from the 60s and reinterpreting them today. So because in France there were crossings between, there are crossings between visual art and performance dance since I must say the 70s, even before, because there were places like Théâtre de la Bastille, or there is the Fall Festival, the Festival d'Automne, which is making a lot of crossings between visual arts and dance performance, theater, music also. And also in the Pompidou we have like shows on the ground floor, first floor, but downstairs we have a big dance and performance scenes, and the mixture are, the public mix the space, you know, they go from downstairs to upstairs, from upstairs to downstairs, and there's kind of, there's no boundaries between the field. It's possible to do performance in the museum. The Fondation Cartier in Paris is inviting dancers inside the museum, and you know, it's like it's a constant exchange. But since a long time now, since I would say the beginning of the 70s.
Yes, I think as Sue was saying in her introduction, I mean, one of the aims of events like this is to somehow renew those exchanges and to catch up a little bit. I mean, I can remember I got interested in performance through trips to New York, where I would see Steve Paxton, Valder Settlefield, Peter Gordon, who also came in those days in the 80s to Hammersmith, and there was work going on here in Sadler's Wells, but I think the main link was between New York and Paris, and London was very much a subsidiary place. And my experience of London was much more that people were in their separate media boxes, so to speak, and this idea of multidisciplinary practice was really being developed in the 60s and 70s in New York, whereas today I think most of artists would think of themselves as multidisciplinary. In fact, it might have even gone to the other extreme, so that in the Royal College where I'm teaching, you may have a printmaking department, but the people, they might be doing performance, they might make films, they won't necessarily make prints, because the concept of what is an art practice today has shifted and taken on board this notion of multidisciplinarity. I've just got a couple more questions, and then I think we can open it out to the floor, because I know there'll be people here with with other. I think one of the other thing that strikes me about that time, and we'll come back to when we talk with Yvonne Rayner, is this idea of performing the everyday and bringing everyday gestures and actions into the frame of performance. And although Nauman is not, I mean, Nauman's work is doing that implicitly, there were other groups like the Judson Group and people like Yvonne Rayner who were working with performance exactly to get away from the history of dance. I mean, they'd studied with Martha Graham and so on, but they actually wanted to make a break with, I think, with the kind of emotional, I don't quite know, we'll have to talk to Yvonne about that, but I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about the sort of wider context of Bruce Nauman's work in this period in relation to other dancers performance artists.
What is the question?
Sorry, I'm just making a question up as I'm talking. Well, I suppose the thing that amazed me when I first saw Yvonne's work was that here was somebody, I mean, Sally Baines wrote this book at that time called Terpsichore in Sneakers, the idea that the dancer was wearing everyday clothes and sneakers, and just performing everyday actions within the frame of the performance space. But then, of course, it became much more complex than that. But nevertheless, it was a real break with an idea that there was a narrative and that there were certain emotional kinds of moods that were supposed to be communicated. It was a much more kind of scientific, exploratory sort of activity.
Yeah, because while you talk, I look at the Bruce Nauman tapes, and it's true that he's not a dancer. He never studied dance, but probably today we would consider this more as part of the dance field, because he's really exploring his body, the limit of his body, in a very systematic way, taking away all the subjectivity out of it. His head is often cut, so we don't see his face emotional. But probably if he was doing that today, it would be more normal and it would be more part maybe of the dance field. But at that time it was really pushing the limit of the body in this everyday attitude and in this research of body vocabulary. But probably we have seen this now very often repeated, extended by other artists, that for us now it seems very normal. But if we have to put that in the context of what's happened at that time, me, I know only Merce Cunningham, Trisha Brown. I don't really know dancers who were dancing very differently from this group of people, but it must have been very revolutionary.
Yeah. I mean, just as other artists like Vito Acconci, who worked with the camera in a much more emotionally involved way. I mean, his monologues to camera are very kind of paranoid, and his voice is very demanding. And today we were at an exhibition at the 176 Gallery, Prince of Wales Road, where there's a young artist, whose name I forget, who's recreated an Acconci piece. And a lot of this work is now the subject of artistic recreations and quotations, although it doesn't, it's an homage, but it doesn't actually have the same power as the original.
I think Vito Acconci tries to externalize the interior of his body. He tries to show outside what's happening inside, because he has this voice, which is a great voice, and he's using his body as a resonance case. So it's very different from Nauman. And Dan Graham was more using it by doubling his image, the same as Peter Campus. They were doubling the image, and so it's very different. So Nauman really is developing a body vocabulary in a very systematic way, like he did with words before or after. Or he did with sculpture by casting part of the bodies, and then after with big multimedia installation.
And were you able to show these when you did your exhibition at the Hayward? Were these already available on video that in your Nauman show?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, yes.
Because some of this work has only been recently available through restorations in America. Okay, well I think maybe Isaac should come and join us now and animate us, or either ask a question or we could open it to the floor. And
yeah, I mean, I was just really thinking about the relationship of these questions really to the present, and thinking about the ways in which, thinking about Nauman and, in a way, his sculptural usage of the body, and thinking about that in relationship to questions around time and temporality. To me, I mean, he poses a sort of epistemological break with art practices and obviously his original intentions and how they've been theorized upon might mark themselves out differently from his kind of original sort of imperatives. But I think it's very fascinating to think about the ways in which this way of thinking about performance has come back as a sort of spectre to haunt the contemporary kind of, art scene. And I think also thinking about the ways in which we may have an interest in different spaces, as I'm thinking about also the choreographic and the way that he's utilizing that. And I wondered, Christine, because in your exhibition, you also, I'm talking about the Hayward exhibition, there was this use of installation work. There was a sort of translation of some of these ideas into moving image and into a sculpture potential. And in a way, it's two questions, really, what you thought about that development and really then this current interest in Nauman today.
What I tried to show in the Hayward Gallery show, Nauman has produced 400 works. So, and in the show there were like 40 works. So it's really it was a very selective choice, and I proposed to work on the relation between image and text. Image and sound text, image and written text. From the beginning till recent work, till work from the 90s. So I didn't emphasize this body performance work, but more is developing the vocabulary, developing, but in a most in terms of writing and sound developing. And because in his work from the beginning, because here we took the sound off, but the sound is also very important. In some of the slides I show you saw some text, and in the multimedia installation he has a very important use of words. And he has a kind of musical sense of poetry. He's also a poet, forget to say it, it's not very obvious in those tapes, but he's also a writer, a poet, and I think in this show I emphasize that aspect more than the body aspect.
Yeah, because it seems to me, that we have had this sort of disappearing figure of Nauman, the fact that he is quite an enigmatic figure. The fact that in Mapping the Studio, Fat Chance John Cage piece, where of course there is no body, and of course in the piece which was at Tate Modern, the Turbine Hall, where the kind of mise en scène, the choreography was really through the sonic register, and this then becomes a different use of language, because of course Nauman's interest in language is of paramount of interest in terms of the way in which we have these sort of Cagean kind of tropes in his work. But I wondered sort of this sort of term that Nauman has taken is something which is very interesting in terms of the way in which you spoke about younger French choreographers working today who have, as it were, investigated this kind of arena. And I wondered, in a way, what was this signaling, this sort of interest in thinking about the choreographic, which becomes this sort of scenario where there is this kind of non-performance, if you like. And to me, we can see these traces in Nauman, we can see it in some of the works of Jerome Bell. And but I just wondered what your ideas may be about that.
There's
There's a question, Catherine. We can open it out, of course, yes.
To ask a question that perfectly followed on from what you just said.
Yes.
I thought one thing that was kind of brought up was now treating his body as sculpture. We didn't think he was a sculptor. And his repetition of gesture as an object. And I wondered if, it just made me think actually about people that endorse the living sculptors, or Bruce Nauman's nice style pose there. And I was thinking about the relationship to Tino Sciarra's work, these installations that have this kind of, they're played by actors in a gallery situation, which have a very, almost like Wayne Harrison-esque intensity of realism to the sculpture. I just wondered if you could say something more about the relationship between the object and the body in his work, and almost this kind of,
because when you speak about sculpture, you speak in a traditional way, in the sculpture as a kind of object that people can grab. Because I think Nauman was more like an installator. He was more creating space in which people could enter and experience themselves. Because after a while, I think after 10 years, Nauman was tired to do this performance alone in his studio. And he created those kind of installations that I show on this, in which it was the spectator himself who was experimenting his body inside the space. And he kind of transferred the role of the artist to the spectator. And this was, I think, an important shift in his career when he stepped away from the scene, when he left and gave the role to the responsibility to the viewer.
how much do you think that was a parody of the kind of discussion going on of the relationship of the spectator's body to the object in minimalism? That was a direct.
I don't understand the question, but maybe Tony Seagal, he took some of the ideas from Nauman because he's transferring also the performance idea to the viewer, to actors, and to the viewer. He's not doing anything himself, but giving the ideas, and the other has to perform.
Yeah, the aesthetic, the making an object of a gesture. But I was thinking about the fact that he was in Jerome Bell's comic before, about that line of genealogy.
Not to make it a completely sort of Anglophone, Francophone scenario, but I do wonder sort of why is it that in that context we can have these translations between different art practices and that sort of engagement, and what I see as interests in this area, but certainly a different sort of relationship, which is much more closed, I think. This has been part of our discussions that we've had here, sort of, and I think it's just something that seems to be kind of, at the same time, bubbling underneath the surface of these sorts of questions, especially when we think about those in relationship to...
I think if we try to draw a historical line, you have some artists who were doing a performance in their studio or in front of the public. Vito Acconci was performing sometime in front of the public in the 60s till the mid-70s. And then the artists, the same artists were transferring their attitude to the viewer. And then in the end of the 80s, the 90s, the year 2000, another generation of artists grabbed the ideas from those 60s, 70s performance and transformed them into something else. There was... but in between, we had those sculpture installation, art object, and that those same artists kind of disappear from the performance scene, but it's other generation who grab those ideas and transform them into something else.
But this is...
I'm interested in history, in your concern with the epistemological break, but also in the fact that it seems to me that you pay attention to art historical histories, art histories, to lineages, to dialogues. So it makes sense that you're talking about a break. I want to understand better about it. Because in the language that we're using, you are asking how is it important for now. So we, in a way, are looking at history are we looking at history in terms of unifying? I mean, our artists are now representing that work. In other words, we seem to be in a time when we're not trying to make an epistemological break, we're doing the opposite, where we're knitting things together and remaking new language and art. Also, it seems to me that we're often very aware, seems to me, in your practice and in your critical practice as well, aware of artist language. Myself, I'm very interested in social history, cultural history. So I'm wondering, you mentioned specifically that one was moving away from history, dance, creativity, and I'm wondering what was modulated. Anyway, please can we discuss a bit more what was the epistemological break? What history did he? What language did he shift into a different gear?
Can you say some of that question again, because I don't think we heard it all. Sorry, so you can just...
Helen's asked me to really describe what I mean by this epistemological break, which I think is a very fair question. And I think, for me, Nauman poses this bridge between this kind of post-minimalist gesture and the ways in which he's using time and temporality and sculpture as a means for communicating a way of moving what I'm describing as this kind of choreographic imagination into another sort of arena or field. And it seems to me that sort of when I've seen some recent works performed mainly by French choreographers, that basically there's been this sort of concern, and this concern has in a way caused a sort of rupture, I think, in thinking about what are the possibilities for the choreographic in a sort of English setting. One which has been able to draw audiences across fields, so both an art audience, a visual arts audience, and a dance audience, and in doing so has created this sort of new language. So maybe you're right, it's not a epistemological break, but it certainly is a sort of turn, if you like, to a history which has been part of a sort of practice connected to contemporary dance and to sort of art practice, but one that hasn't been kind of celebrated or sort of encouraged in this context. And so I think one of the purposes really was to think about that in relationship to the ways in which you might see, for example, examples of these interests in other sort of art practices and spaces, or being, so I think there's that conversation. And also in relationship to really then the historical kind of, or historicizing aspect. So in the case of someone like Eva Rayner, who would be, as it were, performing a sort of epilogue to our prologue, an artist where she looks at the history of dance as part of her own practice for rearticulating a return to the space of performance through film and cinema and back again, you know. So I think there are these sorts of movements and concerns. And also, if one went to perform at 05 or perform at 07 in New York, there are just a number of these movements which are taking place really outside of the gallery, if you like. So there's a kind of reinvention of the kind of theatrical space, a sort of non-gallery space for exploring some of these ideas. You know, so for me, they kind of represent this sort of move, if you like, a reaction to, I would say, artists and the kind of pressure of the sort of marketplace, and I'm defining the marketplace in various terms, which I sort of outlined at the beginning, but also I think a sort of exploration and experimentation, which, you know, is something perhaps, you know, a genuine search for a language, which has been kind of lost to a certain degree. But artists are beginning to sort of, you know, recognize this kind of loss, if you like. So that's a very roundabout way of, you know, so yeah.
If it helps at all, I didn't think I was going to say anything, so I'm not quite sure how good this is going to come out. But you have, I think some English or British dancers have separately developed a more somatic practice. In other words, a way of dealing with the body. And I'm not talking about a technical language. I'm not talking about training. I'm talking about a somatic understanding. And what fascinates me is with that knowledge and with the inquiry which you are talking about, which I think they are deeply concerned and alert about, how do we bring our somatic practice, the integrated body, the fully intelligent experience, and make that recognized in this country at the moment, which is why these series of talks was important to me, because it's a chance for us to open that book and look at it as a little bit more fully. Was that clear? Sort of clear? Sorry.
One of the things, the other thing I was really provoked by in what you were all saying was this question of emotion. And now we're apparently being interested not in the theatrical defining of character, I think what you were saying, but that history of performance, but in presenting the body more objectively, or movement more objectively. And to me, as someone who's now learning more about the language of movement, of dance movement, which I've been looking at closely, especially through film and through contrasting types of movement in, for example, Isaac's work and work made by current people using traditional. As someone learning about dance movement, I tend to see it as a highly emotional expression, as an expression that I register rather irrational and not so conceptual actually. But then Jerome Bell, for example, I would think also be distancing, not dealing with emotion, with perhaps it's metaphorical language. So I was wondering whether this epistemological shift was in some sense to do with emotion, or how metaphor is character or where it is somehow in the work. So anyway, I'm so interested that you talk about a somatic approach, because that is not necessarily a conceptual and rational or conceptual approach.
No.
I think it's about being, so you intuit the...
It's trying to make the connection. It's not trying to lose one at the expense of the other. I don't mean to make that sound reductionist, but it's trying to be the whole. So if it's if you're having a somatic response, why would it not at certain points include emotion, and why would it not at certain points need a form of structuralism as a part of that?
And the scrutiny that Nauman is making specifically, which Steve, you mentioned from what he said, is that he discovered that certain movements in this very highly defined, this designed exploration, this design is created which he then performs, and as he performs the simple minimum structure, he experiences the body as it, what its capacities are as a human body, gravity, muscular movement, but also what is emotional about some of those movements and which simply are not. It's one of the things he read out. So emotion is in there in a very different way than I expected to be there in dance. And I think of dance language and visual art, movement and visual art have been very, very different things. And that's, I think, my own take on it. But I'm curious. So, and I'm going to just look very about the massacre, about beauty. I don't know what you're talking about beauty when you're talking about the movement and stuff. I see it as a much barer, squarer thing. So I'm not quite sure what I'm saying.
Emotion. In most of his work, you never see any expression. He's also influenced by Beckett, and in Beckett theater, emotion is often erased, not there. And repetition is there, but emotion is not visible. It's kind of hidden, controlled, hidden, and I think he's in the same process. In recent work, in the work from the end of the 80s, he exaggerates this aspect, because some of the big video installation where he used an actor, and they exaggerate this emotional aspect of the human attitude. But at that time, I think he was a minimalist artist, and emotion was not admitted.
Yes.
You having a sort of similar kind of experience of it as you would have done in the 60s. And in a way, it's an impossible question, because obviously you can't travel back in time. But, how do you deal with that? And how do you manage to convey the distance that the contemporary audience has to travel, both back in time, but also they have, at the same time, these 2 or 3 generations of artists who worked with ideas and transformed them, so there's a whole vocabulary that we have, as you described, coming back to the work. It's somehow, when you think of it like that, it makes curating impossible, that you can't do it you can't get back to those originary meanings in a way.
But I think each year has its own interpretation, and I think art history is building itself through this accumulation of interpretation and reinterpretation and reinterpretation. Do we have to go really back to what's the attitude of the 60s, 70s? Maybe not. Maybe we live with this accumulation of aesthetical interpretation. We live with it. It's our knowledge, and we transfer the knowledge. Of course, there are some lost, probably, but some people will rediscover, and and maybe things, some aspects are lost forever. Who knows? But it's the way I think history goes, and.
But one of the things that was happening then that you also point that connects with this was this interest in a 0 degree of signification. Barthes writing 0 degree of literature, the group Cahiers Peinture Théorique in Paris, this idea that somehow you could strip a work of art down to its minimalist essence. And actually, we realize that that's impossible because, as people have been saying here, emotion always comes back in. And actually, in the most, these are the pretty minimal kinds of experiences, but nevertheless people can feel the emotion in them and not maybe like when they're watching a Hollywood film, but it's nevertheless an emotional response, and so you can't actually get to that sort of 0 degree of signification where you just have the materiality of the work, and that was one of the dominant ideas of the time, I think.
At the same time, it's true that people, when they experience those installations, some of the viewer, they have like, they put a lot of emotion into it. And I think that was not the purpose of the artist, but it's happening. The children also enjoy those installations. They really enjoy in another way. So it's kind of something else happening that was not intended by the artist.
Maybe it was intended. It was actually intended. I mean, so I'm taking issue with that. Actually, I would probably think that maybe it was intended, and it's actually the openness of it and the engagement, kind of, and not knowing how people will respond, and that people are all so different, they will respond. By necessity, he's made something that allows for that response. Yeah. So, yeah. So it's
Possibilities.
But maybe they're very pessimistic ones. I mean, maybe this 0 field of signification, if that's about right, means that what he has is a kind of, the minimalism derives from having that and then a series of repeatable variations on top of that. Maybe he's just saying, on top of my body I can walk in this way, or I can walk in that way, or I can walk in this way.
Well, maybe then it comes out just boredom in the studio. And then it's pleasure. And then that covers all this gamut of kind of umbrellas it all in. And people don't talk about boredom like if you're bored, you're a dull person. Actually, you get bored all the time, personally. So it's like maybe that's a way to sort of deal with this work.
I'm not talking about boredom. I think I'm talking about hitting an end of possibilities within a language somehow. Yeah. And sorry, yes, and so that's why I find it very difficult to know quite where the emotion, how to locate the emotion in this piece somehow.
Would you say the emotion is the thing that isn't there? Because I think that's what the sculptural language is.
Well,
it's not within the object, it's within the phantom object that we cannot see. And that's, when he started to make things out of glass and I actually think the way he made the viewer walk around those things, stalk them endlessly, and the quality of them being very unfinished, was actually not traditional. It was enormously untraditional. And I think we see the presence of this absent object here like a kind of state of loss, I would say. I know it's a very cliche thing to say, but I think there's an enormous physical presence in these works, which is where I would place the emotion, is in the thing you can't see, the invisible. And I think that's what a sculptural language is, in my opinion.
But then how can you look at these works today?
Through exactly that, because we've had a whole, how many years have we had of the sculptural object as an image? And I think looking at now and again, we're seeing this invisible language reclaimed in a way, but I don't think traditionally, I think in a very, I think they're startlingly new, whatever that word means, because they are kind of non-material, and therefore they challenge the whole commodification issue, blah, blah, blah.
One of the book I think he was aware of was the Merleau-Ponty, The Visible and the Invisible. It's really, yeah.
So I think, don't you think, Pablo, that's where we can intersect today, is through how...
Can you say more about how, do you mean the crystallization of the gesture as an object,
or that we see gesture, but we don't see the object. Well, what we see is a space in which an action is taking place, but there's a kind of refusal for an object to reveal itself. So I think we're seeing a very spatial.
Are you making? I mean, like he made casts under chairs.
Yes,
Cast
yes.
casts
Then he
under
went
space under a chair.
much
You
further
see.
than that.
Are you thinking of that as almost an equivalent of the containment of the studio space within the kind of blocky TV monitor, and how he's testing that out?
No, I'm seeing like the way he's rocking backwards and forwards into this corner, as though he's coming up against two completely contrasting physical experiences. One is the point where, you know, he doesn't let his body fall completely forward. So there's a kind of physical presence where it might do that, but there's also a physical presence of the corner itself. So it's like...
That's the screen in the corner as to, borders of the space.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. That's what I would see as something that he was then able to put into these plaster and very, very physicalized forms of it.
I mean, I don't know. I think that the problem I have with these works is that there's an implicit need to believe in the physical body of the artist, if that makes sense.
Or not?
You need, I think you need to believe in he needs to have a body that can run through these different gestural possibilities. And that's something that for me ties up with a strand of an art that is just not existent anymore. It's impossible to look at these works.
Oh, yeah, that's a different, yes. Yeah, I think it would be very difficult to make Bruce Nauman now.
I just wanted to do any other questions from the other side. Because this side has been dominated, which is very good, you know, but... No, okay. We're happy spectators.
In your description of what performance can be, it's like real space, real time. Or there was the fourth, whatever it was called, forthcoming demand that's necessary. These all exist as video works, is that right? So they aren't performed in front of people. So then that kind of ties back into now there's this sort of situation where they're video art collectors, and that's kind of to go back into your market kind of thing. But these then actually jump straight into that again. Does that make sense?
They don't really, because I mean, the history of these works is that they were basically saved by electronic arts intermix by the Kramlik Trust, because these works were in disrepair, and so they've been repaired basically, and that's why they exist. So in a sense, it is a collector's interest that has restored what we see today. So that question of conservation is there. But, you know, I think sort of, you know, it certainly is...
Officially advice video, the way things are, the way things can look like, that you can now buy as a 12.99 DVD, which I think is great in that kind of way. It's sort of...
Yes, and you can, you know... You can buy these from Electronic Arts Intermix in New York.
These are limited edition, and they are circulating in university, art school. It's very easy to rent them, to get them,
But I think
the
question that's coming up is, we can do that and we can understand it art historically, but then how do artists, choreographers and performers work with this knowledge today, which seems to be, it's not at all clear that you can. I mean, maybe Jérôme Bell looks and draws inspiration from them, but actually it's quite difficult to, for instance, if you just imitate the work it's not terribly interesting. And we saw something today which was doing exactly that, as I said, with Conchi, that the strategy of imitation, reduplication, is something that the art world's quite familiar with, and people are forever remaking work, but that doesn't get into any of the sort of original charge and the project and the idea of the sort of scientific research on the body and all the things we're talking about. But that may be it may be that what people have to do is study the work and then do something completely different.
You see, concentration is not. I've heard so many dance artists experience this work in this country and talk about deliberation and concentration and not spinning out of control. I think maybe it's the discipline of it.
And also, it seems to me that it's very difficult post-Nauman, because whether Nauman likes it or not, he has become a paradigm, for thinking about certain moments in contemporary art. And I think especially for thinking about the question of the choreographic in a sort of art context. So I think it's really, in that sense, his value has been created through this discursive means of the work being able to be available in an educational context. Art critics who have written about his work, it's very difficult to, in a way, surpass the kind of writings, I think, about his work in relationship to thinking about the questions around sort of post-minimalism, etc. But, and in those works, I think the question of irony is discussed, but I think the sculptural potential of the work, and precisely this question of the phantom scene, which I think haunts our contemporary art scene, is provided by the ways in which, certainly thinking about his piece for Tate Modern, it was precisely the sonic use of sound as sculpture, which was, in a sense, could have been incredibly powerful, I think, if left to its own devices in terms of its sonic level, perhaps, as a sort of presence, but nonetheless is very much sort of part of his language, I think, of, and Map in the Studio, Fat Chance of John Cage, again, is very much about this sort of, phantom sort of usage, I think is really very important to think about the ways in which we're sort of discussing the choreographic imagination and where that leaves one. So I don't know if there are any other questions.
Sorry, from this side. I just wanted to know about the setup and the setup within the films, because I guess from a contemporary point of view, it'd be inconceivable to do this kind of work assuming that you weren't going to be inspected on all of the conventions that come up around the artist studio, ways of behaving, ways of dressing, and so on. And I just wanted to know how studied Nauman was in all of this. Whether he had a T-shirt that he wore, whether he used a particular colour tape, whether he tidied the studios, whether he all of that stuff.
I think he just worked in the studio as it is, and he was wearing the clothes that he was wearing. I think he didn't really transform the situation. You can also see in the mapping the studio, he used the studio as it is, the studio, he put cameras in the surveillance camera in the studio, and it's an empty space with the dust and some sculpture in the corner, and it's I think it didn't transform anything. And I think here it's the same, it's just like that every day, it's like wear the t-shirt and a jean.
And I was going to ask Christina, which is really following on from Pablo, is what happened to the tapes? Leo Castelli gave him the camera and he made these tapes, but did he then treat them as works of art and put them into circulation, or what happened to them? Because You could say
they
that...
They were rent by Leo Castelli. He had a videotape rental system.
Right.
Before Electronics and Mix.
So that he made these tapes and sent them back to New York, and then they were
limited. They were limited, and you could rent them.
So they were limited, and you could rent them.
Yeah, there was a videotape, Leo Castelli videotape rental system.
Make it different from if it was just sort of research that he was doing for his own purposes. But actually, it was always intended to be in circulation.
Yeah, it was done to be shown. Yeah.
Yeah.
Catherine.
I was just going to respond to Pablo's question and your answer, because I think it's really important to consider the theatre of that self-presentation, even if it was what you really wore. Think of the context of like Andy Warhol's presentation of himself as an artist, or Picasso and Nick, or Dali arriving in New York with a kind of easel and a moustache. But no, just these cliches of the artist persona in their studio, or kind of fabulous self-presentation. To actually present yourself in such a mundane, neutral way is a very theatrical, anti-theatrical staging anyway. And I think that's really important in relation to Von Rayner's work, which it did present neutral, ordinary movement and people wearing jeans and t-shirts, but again it was a studied aesthetic, a deliberate aesthetic, and a theatre that was, setting itself against conventions which seem neutral in theatre usually. So I mean, at the time I think historical imagination would have stood out.
More anti-aesthetic. He didn't want to present himself as an artist. He's just a human. He's just himself as a human being.
But
it's more like...
It's strange that a human being wouldn't come dressed as Louis XIV, but he would come dressed in jeans and a t-shirt.
I think that's it. I think that's a good...
Dressing himself in those videos, he's actually got his uniform on, it seems to me. It's not casual at all. I mean, it's not... I don't believe that he just kind of thought, oh, I'll put any other thing on, and I'm going to go to my studio and do what I'm going to do. It seems quite formal to me in terms of talking about his dress code. It's quite presentations. Like he's thought that through. I'm going to wear my white and my black. They're going to be clean, ironed, it's going to be very pristine. And my studio's going to be a mess, and he's going to have all this stuff. And I'm going to pinpoint the camera. So he makes a point of the fact that there's a kind of structure between himself. He's quite well dressed, quite clean, and he's got all this stuff around him. These are all decisions that he's made very, very particularly. I mean, it's just going, it's very, very particular.
But I don't know. I'm not sure that that's the issue. Maybe he did or didn't do that, but the fact that we see that it becomes part of what we see and how we read and understand it is really significant. And so in the end, he still has to take responsibility for it.
Well,
and so I don't know if it's a decided thing, but it's a significant aspect. I know I went down and everyone saw that studio and thought, God, these guys always make me laugh. They always take a certain kind of body and they have a certain kind of expression and that studio stage. And I actually did giggle, not maybe for reasons that but it just seemed like of such a type, of such a era, of such a place, and it does carry a kind of baggage with it. And I think we do find meaning in that, and that's what's significant about it.
Which is why we then go back to how it was, and the way to go back to what you were saying about to recreate.
Well, we also have to remember that the audience brings half of the meaning to the piece.
Yes, and the audience
and it's not just what the artist does, it's what we bring to it that finalizes, which is what Cunningham is also very interested in as well.
And I think also when he was in conversation with Richard Brown and, he was aware of, this sort of movement, that was revolution that was taking place in dance. We can think about, Richard Brown's sort of back piece, for example, which again, is quite a sort of minimalist presentation of the body. So it's a language which is sort of circulating. But Helen, maybe if we're probably going to come to close.
I think maybe we could discuss it and listen to you discussing it in the other conversations, but
thank you very much, and for being here and being part of the second series of Parallel Voices. I think we have to thank Alison at the back, who has put tireless time in this whole sort of series. So thank you very much, Alison. And Christine, thank you so much for coming here and your very kind patience with us, dealing with our Anglophone anxieties about a Francophone sort of scenario, and we're very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And last but not least, thank you very much, Mark,
that's fine.
for your contribution.